This week we went to the Ohio State House in Columbus to see various contractors and members of the America's Prosperity Organization try to repeal Ohio Bill 1163, the Prevailing Wage Act, which requires private contractors to pay prevailing wages to employees on all construction projects receiving more than $2,000 in federal funding. In case you didn't know, the Prevailing Wage Act originates from the 1931 Davis-Bacon Act, which was passed in order to prevent non-unionized black and immigrant laborers from competing with unionized white workers. Much to my surprise, upon entering the State House, I found that it was built on an underground railroad site, which is ironic because after escaping cheap labor in the South via slavery, for refuge here in the North, the fight for economic opportunity remains for blacks, immigrants, and as we'll see today, even rural America. I hope you appreciate and learn from this series of intellectual discourses on an issue that will affect all taxpayers. That's everyone, including you listening to this, whoever you may be. We give you a front row seat on educating your state representatives to ensure your voice is truly heard. We've seen the marching, we've seen the protesting, we talk about boycotting. This is a different level, this is something different, and I hope you enjoy it and take from it what you will.
The conception of prevailing wage back in 1931 during the Great Depression was largely to keep minority-owned businesses and laborers from being able to move north and to be able to take away labor from local and usually white business owners. So as a result, several known racist legislators in Congress decided to introduce the bill, which, by the way, this was the 13th bill targeting minorities that was meant to help keep them out of being able to bid for public contracts. Now, even though we're now 80 plus years later, it still hasn't impacted minorities today because the opportunities to be able to get into large contracting companies often doesn't lie where minorities live. So back in the 1930s, it was much cheaper, much like today, cheaper to live in the South than in the North. Cost of living was much lower. So when the economy dried up during the Great Depression, there was still some business going on up in the northern part of the country. And so as a result, in search of work and labor, you had folks coming from the South, coming up north, and those that were coming from the South, they were willing to work, just happy to be making some kind of money, and they were able to underbid the contractors that lived up in the northern part of the country. So prevailing wage gave a minimum standard that you have to be paying at least this much on wages in order to be able to bid the job in the first place. The first time that this started really hurting minorities was back in the 1930s. At that time, because you didn't have very many minority-owned businesses, certainly not that were able to deal with the other regulations, not just the pay rates, but the other regulations around prevailing wage. The other thing too is there was still some very much entrenched racism that was taking place within the local governments. When there was not prevailing wage, well, minority-owned businesses were able to simply bid lower labor rates, and it was hard to turn down a good job done for less money. Once prevailing wage was implemented, it took away the excuse of something being economical, and it gave the excuse then for whatever that local government wanted to do, they were going to use the local company that was charging the same wages. Today, many politicians want to protect prevailing wage for a couple of reasons. One being, it helps them feel better about themselves. They think that they are being benevolent and paying more money to contractors and to construction workers. It makes them feel better because, people are making more money as a result of this. We're paying higher rates. On the same token, what they failed to account for is the fact that this also means that taxpayers have to pay more money. The question is, at the end of the day, who owns the money that our government spends? Is it you as the taxpayer, or is it a government politician?
We own the money.
We own the money. Prosperity in Ohio. You already heard our introductions as far as to the thousands, but I particularly want to thank our activists that you see here today. Some are indicated through their green scarves due to the heat. Some have come off, and also we ran out, and others are in the overflow room. But I want to thank them because that's why we do is through activists connected into the legislative process. Now, we all know there are two sides to every story, and here on Cap Squared, many of us know there are two sides to every tight state budget. The same is true of a local government budget. And state governments not only have influence over the revenue streams of local governments, but in many cases, this body regulates aspects of local expenditures. Over the past 6 years, Governor Kasich and this body have cut the local government fund, LGF, in half, but have done very little to alleviate the strain caused by anticipated regulations such as prevailing wage laws. Now, prevailing wage is an artificial labor market construct of the undeniably racist Davis-Bacon Act of 1931. And the intention was to require all capital improvement projects to pay a higher labor wage to keep minority-owned or operated businesses from underbidding white labor. Also in 1931, the Ohio 89th General Assembly passed House Bill 3 to enact state prevailing wage standards to prevent out-of-state contractors, hungry for work during the Depression era, from undercutting local contractors. Nearly 90 years later, we continue to cling to the same laws, even though they raise the cost of public projects by as much as 10 to 37%, depending on the trade. Now, over the past 3 years, Wisconsin, Indiana, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Arkansas have repealed their prevailing wages entirely. And several other states are considering following suit as they seek hundreds of millions of dollars in savings at a time state budgets are already being stretched thin. And so Ohio is no exception. And the experience of other states shows that repealing this outdated and burdensome mandate would free millions of dollars to be invested into classroom supplies, road pavements, teacher raises, or any number of other essential priorities for the state. While this body may not be quite prepared to eliminate the mandate entirely, at the very least, it should allow cash-strapped local governments the freedom to decide for themselves the burden that their taxpayers face. Now, 20 years ago, Ohio voted to exempt school construction from prevailing wage. And 4 years later, the state's Legislative Service Commission found that the state had saved over $487 million without any negative impact on quality or construction wages. Now, I want to pause here and deviate with the indulgence of the chairman from my written testimony because Representative Shea, you asked a very legitimate question earlier and pointed to the Economic Policy Institute study asking about non-prevailing wage states. Now, if we look at the roots of the prevailing wage legislation and when it was implemented, there was a stronger version. There's another parallel track for many of these laws and when they're instituted on the state level, and the other track is much known as right to work. And as many of us know from the conversation surrounding right to work over even the past 10 years around this legislative body, we know that it is primarily poor southern states and rural western states that never adopted labor or organized labor legislation in the first place. And so as a result, you are absolutely right that there is a significant gap in wages, not just in construction, but across the board. Now, and you may find it interesting to know that this even continues between Ohio and Washington, D.C. And in fact, a legislator in Ohio, I thought you might like to know, makes 290% less than a legislator in D.C. I thought you might like to know. Now, in Michigan, that state's brief suspension of their mandate, well, it added an additional 11,000 jobs. And the nonpartisan Anderson Economic Group found that Michigan's prevailing wage cost the state an additional $2 billion from 2002 to 2011, which would have been enough to give every teacher a $1,600 raise, with $87 million left over. And just last year, the Associated Builders and Contractors of West Virginia, affiliated with the Ohio chapter that just testified, estimated that that state's taxpayers saved $20 million in just 2 months after prevailing wage repeal went into effect because of the projects that were freed up and were able to be commenced that previously were cost prohibitive. Now, these are the kinds of savings that our local governments deserve the opportunity to realize in an attempt to maximize value for taxpayers. Now, special interests will, as usual, attempt to stand in the way of progress because the prevailing wage mandate shrinks the competition they face, which unsurprisingly increases taxpayer costs. And the process is such that primarily large and often unionized contractors can compete for public projects, which also shrinks the talent pool. Since the vast majority of the workers is not unionized, we referred earlier talking about 80%, hurting competition and quality as well as increasing that cost. In fact, the very creation of the prevailing wage decades ago was for this exact purpose, to insulate entrenched interests from competitors who might do the job cheaper and, God forbid, better. The prevailing wage might be a good deal for special interests who benefit from increasing taxpayer costs, but it is a bad deal for workers, taxpayers, and all those who depend on other services from the government. As House Bill 163 allows local governments the opportunity to opt out of our state's costly and burdensome prevailing wage mandate, it has garnered broad support from the NFIB, the Ohio Chamber of Commerce, the County Commissioners Association of Ohio, the Ohio Municipal League, the Ohio Township Association, and the Inter-University Council. Americans for Prosperity Ohio has marked this legislation as a key vote on our legislative scorecard. We ask that this committee favorably report the bill to the full House. Now, there's one thing to remember as we sit in this committee room. And I wish that Representative Reese was still here and so that I could point directly to her question earlier. I say this very carefully. For those of you who represent an urban district, this bill is primarily not for you. This bill is for the rural communities in Ohio where the cost of living is substantially less than it is in wealthier portions of the state. And you'll hear more testimony today about what that means for some rural communities. Now, for myself, and maybe this disqualifies from testifying in a way because there's a direct impact for me. I'm just a poor kid from Appalachian, Ohio without a high school diploma. My family comes from organized labor construction companies, and they worked in the coal mines and they've driven trucks. I can tell you right now that they would prefer to make a market wage, even if it is less and is reflective of the cost of living in rural Ohio. They'd have no work at all, because communities are too strapped on their budgets to be able to commence work or go to work in the morning in the first place. Chairman Young. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, for indulging our activists that have filled this committee room and are in the overflow room. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions related to this bill this time.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sheehy.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your passionate testimony. And I'd just like to point out, Mr. Chairman, you made reference the second time today to the...
If you could, try to make it a question. Please.
Okay, if you recall, this is the second time you made reference to the undeniably racist Davis-Bacon Act, and at its core, at the time, may have been, just like there were racist bedrock for our United States Constitution. Now, we've overcome those things. We've worked to overcome those things, and organized labor, to their credit, has done an awful lot to right themselves from that legislation. And there are people in this room today who are an example of labor organizations people who belong to labor organizations who are people of color, who represent people of color, and I know represent that reference to that insidious part of Davis-Bacon Act. In the whole, it has protected American workers. That had, I believe. But the question, Mr. Chairman, if you would allow me, and also you made reference a little bit earlier to that in your testimony about that $487 million negative impact on the quality of construction jobs, and I just wonder if you still stand by that, because you're aware that that LSC study was completely debunked by Professor Herbert Weinberg of the Ohio State University. And are you also aware that the former LSC director, James Burley, did not contest Weinberg's finding on that proclaimed savings were illegitimate? So if you would speak to that, and I have a number of other things that I'll concede. I'll have some comrades here to speak and ask questions.
Thank you. Chairman Young, and to Representative Sheehy, you raise excellent points, and they're points that are constantly points of conflict around this very issue. To the end of racism, I disagree that our Constitution is racist. I do believe that our Constitution failed to be fully implemented to its true values from the beginning. And as you know, some of our founding fathers were deeply conflicted over that very thing because they knew that they were failing to implement what was meant to be the American dream and that it was unequal. And that's why we have heroes like Frederick Douglass who recognized that we had phenomenal founding in this country, and they spent their lives going from not even owning their own bodies to becoming 1%ers in this nation because they believed in the values and the principles in that very Constitution. So I disagree with that premise. However, I do agree that, like other things, that it is possible for something to change over time. When we talk about this legislation specifically, I disagree that this continued over decades to discriminate against people of color. And I understand there are some people of color that may disagree with me. I also know that there are people of color in this very room that do agree with me as well. And I don't think that we need to get into that match of saying, well, where does the population as a whole stand? We're looking at the principles. When we talked about that LSC study, you're right. I'm aware about Professor Weisenberg, the voter turnout model expert, who wrote a paper commissioned by the Council of Trades, saying that it was invalid. And the entire premise, and there was actually a more recent study that, by the way, was written by specialists in the field, in construction management, in economics, and contracting. That was more recent, and that actually just came out this year in 2016. They both used the same premise, and I want to come back to that in one moment. But when we talk about LSC and the fact that they never stood up, thank God that we have a nonpartisan, non-political Legislative Service Commission here in the state of Ohio that does not speak out and conflict with anything that's said in the private sector. It's not their job. I have sat in interested party rooms before where I have watched people devalue and debase our Legislative Service Commission, claiming that they're not experts, that they don't understand the operations of the law, and say that their opinion on the matter was invalid. And I watched that attorney in that room not even defend themselves when they said, well, they're not even a litigator. As it turns out, that particular attorney who never attended themselves because they were not proud enough and didn't care enough about their own identity, they cared about the integrity of LSC. They sat there and didn't even defend themselves and saying, by the way, I have nearly 10 years of litigation experience. The same is true here. There were numerous articles and there were people in academia who threw accusations at saying this is invalid and unqualified study. And you're right, that commissioner never stood up to try to defend himself because his ego didn't get in the way. However, if he had been asked by a legislator at that time, could you please clarify your study and can you address the weaknesses that have been pointed out by this voter turnout model expert? Could you please explain that? If someone would have asked him at the time, if a legislator would have, they would have answered those questions. And that did not happen. However, fortunately, when this 2017 study came out back in April, there was such a request that was made. And Ross Miller from LSC made such a response, and I'm not sure if the chairman has provided it at this time to this committee, but I would encourage for you to seek it out, or Mr. Chairman, I don't know if you shared it or not, I'm happy to share it through your office if you'd like. They did provide that response. And one very key thing they pointed to was an assumption that was made. It's a very interesting one. If you get into the weeds on these things, and I know that you do, and I know not all legislators do, I know that you do, one of the most key points was there was concern that the Dodge regression is what was used in order to determine what the savings were. And both for Professor Weisenberg and also for the study that was released earlier this year, what was asked at that time is, well, did you ever stop to think for 1 second that these are all based off the bids and not any change orders or what the actual cost ended up being? Fair question. However, that was the foundational premise of those responding studies. Now, on the same token, that question, that debunking, if you will, fails to recognize one other thing. If those contracts went over, and keep in mind, half of the contracts were performed on those schools by the exact same contractors who executed prevailing wage jobs. If those contracts went over not paying prevailing wage, is that to say that they never would have gone over the original bid if they were prevailing wage? Are we saying that prevailing wage bids never go over their original bid? So the second part of the serious flaw that lies within those studies has to do with what they looked at. And in fact, we find this within Mr. Miller's response from LSC when he said that in this particular case, the inclusion of one single prevailing wage dummy variable implies that the differential in bid amounts due to paying prevailing wages is assumed to be the same no matter what type of construction project is involved. And this is false. To illustrate this concept, nearly half of the projects the authors analyzed were of the lowest cost type overall. Specifically, asbestos abatement or demolition projects. They are the lowest cost. Now, I know all of us work enough with economics and budgeting to know that when we're talking about something that from the base is the lowest amount, absolutely there's going to be a smaller different or a smaller savings projection or realization to what there is something that has a higher base value. And we all know this. This is Economics 101. We deal with it every single budget cycle. When we're talking about these studies, and we've already talked about it, there are studies on both sides of this. And that's fine. When we look at these specifically, to say that LSC was debunked is false. We have to look at the flaws in the study that was brought forward, and I encourage, because as a legislative aide and clerking in committee, LSC saved my butt many a times. I gotta say, that if you have a question about whether or not something from this is valid, ask them to clarify. That'd be my encouragement, because it's helped me considerably times in the past.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I want to make a clarification right now, right here, and I want an apology, or you misunderstood. If you thought I said that I thought the Constitution was racist, I said the bedrock of the Constitution was based on some things that might have been racial. But I would appreciate an apology for that. I want you to know that you talk about a family that is sacrificed, that has been maybe treated unfairly in the economic world of this country. And I come from a family of 12, all working class stiffs. I made my living in steel-toed shoes and more bib overalls than you have years. And okay, and I have a strong military background for sisters and brothers, and I resent.
Representative, you have to represent. Sorry.
Well, first of all, if
There was an accusation made.
I would actually like to answer the question. I want to make no accusations at all. I actually do want to issue an apology, because to this point, again, I don't understand the ambiguation between between bedrock and Constitution. I apologize. That's my fault. And so, if I am misunderstanding, I truly am sorry for implying that that is what you're saying. And perhaps you and I can offline later, because I would love to understand the difference between the two. To that end, though, also, and this is a passionate issue for all of us, isn't it?
It is, and it seems like you're giving more of the time to the speaker than you are the members of the committee.
That's not my intention.
Okay.
Let's move on. We're on committee activities.
I'm sure there are more.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond? Fairly.
Let's move on.
Understood, Chairman.
Any other questions? Representative Weiss.
Yes, let me just clarify this. So are you suggesting that the African Americans make less money under prevailing wage or no opportunity under prevailing wage, and thus going with this approach, African Americans would fare better?
Sure. So, Chairman Young, for the representative, I was saying that for decades that certainly was an implication. The implication was that that minority-owned businesses never even have the opportunity to get into the bidding process. And this was a construct that furthered that. I'm not saying that weren't kept out in the first place. As we all know, there are bad actors in government of this country. There were bad, certainly more so in the 1930s, and unfortunately there continues to be today. And that's unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable. Prevailing wage, unfortunately, as constructed, and keep in mind one very important thing that I think gets lost when we're talking about the cost in here. It's very easy to infer that the only implication of prevailing wage is, well, what's in the paycheck of the labor, of the worker, what do they receive, what do they take home with them? And that is not all the prevailing wage is. Prevailing wage has an astronomical amount of regulation around it, including the responsibilities of filing on a weekly basis. Now, as Representative Shannon was pointing to, in my case, God, my hat's off. If he's got more years of steel-toed boots than I've got years, period. I only did a few years of masonry labor, and it wasn't for me. I got as fast as I could. It wasn't for me. Now, with that said, I can still lay stone, and I got a pretty good retaining wall. My dad's to prove it, so I'm happy. When we talk about what does that mean for real wages today, I'm not implying that today the people of color don't have the opportunity to make the same money. Unfortunately, as was referred to just a little while in our discussion around the Constitution, we are a nation that heals. And it doesn't always come about perfectly, but it does heal, and I say the same applies to wages. And there's a long way still left to go. I mean, that's another conversation for another time that I'd love to have, because I think we'd have a lot of agreement.
Follow.
And then just, if you could address the issue, because you kept talking about local cities can benefit by this piece of legislation. Isn't it true that through prevailing wages, cities are to bear more, or actually better, because now they are able to get, that's how they get their money, income tax. So the more people make, the more taxes the city has to repair the roads, to hire police officers and so on and so forth. So under this bill, cities could then not have prevailing wage, which means they pay lower wages, which means they have less money coming in their coffers to be able to take care of or address those issues. How do you explain that?
Through the chairman, to the representative, please forgive me for what sounds slightly like sarcasm, but I didn't know you believed in trickle-down economics. This is, because that is the implication, is that if we feed more taxpayer dollars into wages through contracting, then we'll get more money back. And the government is not the arbiter of, it is not a philanthropist. It is not Bill Gates. It is not Mark Zuckerberg, who is some of the largest philanthropists in the world. It is meant to be the steward of our taxpayer dollars. And so, I would encourage a number of aspects to look at, in that whose money was it to arbitrate in the first place? And I disagree that government is the channel to boost paychecks. At least, if we're going to boost them, let's do it on the tax side, not do it on the payment side.
So follow-up.
Follow.
So then you're saying that we should not invest in our citizens by paying them a good wage in order for them to be able to contribute to their community?
Well, the implication in that, the chairman, to the representative, the implication in that then would be that prevailing wage is the only reason that people make any decent wage whatsoever. And I believe that's false. And that's been demonstrated multiple times, both in states that do not have prevailing wage laws or have conditional prevailing wage laws. And in the case of Ohio, I'll tell you, in my case specifically, I worked in an open shop, and I came in as a laborer. I didn't know the first thing about masonry. Biggest project, I built a chicken coop with my father once. That was the biggest project I had. And I learned about caulking on that, but I didn't learn anything about masonry. And I was a laborer. I was a good laborer. I worked very hard. I wasn't the smartest laborer, but I did work very hard. And I normally made $12 an hour. On a prevailing wage site down in Portsmouth, Ohio, working on some HUD housing, I made $34 an hour. And I'll tell you right now that 20-year-old me, I was very excited to be making $34 an hour. I can also tell you with a straight face, and I'm not ashamed because I really enjoyed that $34 an hour, that I did not earn $34 an hour.
Very good. Thank you for the testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As fast as I could. It wasn't for me. Now, with that said, I can still lay stone, and I got a pretty good retaining wall at my dad's to prove it, so I'm happy. When we talk about what does that mean for real wages today, I'm not implying that today the people of color don't have the opportunity to make the same money. Unfortunately, as was referred to just a little while in our discussion around the Constitution, we are a nation that heals. And it doesn't always come about perfectly, but it does heal, and I say the same applies to wages. And there's a long way still left to go. I mean, that's another conversation for another time that I'd love to have, because I think we'd have a lot of agreement.
Follow.
And then just, if you could address the issue, because you kept talking about local cities can benefit by this piece of legislation. Isn't it true that through prevailing wages, cities are to bear more, or actually better, because now they are able to get, that's how they get their money, income tax. So the more people make, the more taxes the city has to repair the roads, to hire police officers and so on and so forth. So under this bill, cities could then not have prevailing wage, which means they pay lower wages, which means they have less money coming in their coffers to be able to take care of or address those issues. How do you explain that?
through the chairman, to the representative. Please forgive me for what sounds slightly like sarcasm, but I didn't know you believed in trickle-down economics. This is, because that is the implication, is that if we feed more taxpayer dollars into wages through contracting, then we'll get more money back. And the government is not the arbiter of, it is not a philanthropist. It is not Bill Gates, it is not Mark Zuckerberg, who is some of the largest philanthropists in the world. It is meant to be the steward of our taxpayer dollars. And so, I would encourage a number of aspects to look at, in that whose money was it to arbitrate in the first place? And I disagree that government is the channel to boost paychecks. At least, if we're going to boost them, let's do it on the tax side, and not do it on the payment side.
So follow-up. So then you're saying that we should not invest in our citizens by paying them a good wage in order for them to be able to contribute to their community?
Well, the implication in that, the chairman, to the representative, the implication in that then would be that prevailing wage is the only reason that people make any decent wage whatsoever. And I believe that's false. And that's been demonstrated multiple times, both in states that do not have prevailing wage laws or have conditional prevailing wage laws. And in the case of Ohio, I'll tell you, in my case specifically, I worked in an open shop, and I came in as a laborer. I didn't know the first thing about masonry. Biggest project, I built a chicken coop with my father once. That was the biggest project I had. And I learned about caulking on that, but I didn't learn anything about masonry. And I was a laborer. I was a good laborer. I worked very hard. I wasn't the smartest laborer, but I did work very hard. And I normally made $12 an hour. On a prevailing wage site down in Portsmouth, Ohio, working on some HUD housing, I made $34 an hour. And I'll tell you right now that 20-year-old me, I was very excited to be making $34 an hour. I can also tell you with a straight face, and I'm not ashamed because I really enjoyed that $34 an hour, that I did not earn $34 an hour.
Very good. Thank you for the testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.